The first formal meeting took place 48 hours after contact, aboard an orbital station called Haven Point. It was not a grand diplomatic hall. It was a commercial hub that had been cleared out in a hurry, and it still smelled like engine grease, instant coffee, and the faint metallic tang of recycled air. Someone had dragged a long table into the main cargo bay and surrounded it with mismatched chairs. A banner reading, "Welcome to Haven Point," had been taped above the door, slightly crooked. LawHFY walked in and tried not to let his disappointment show. He had conducted first contact meetings in crystal palaces, in floating temples, in chambers carved from living stone deep beneath alien oceans. He had never conducted one in a room that still had forklift marks on the floor. The human delegation was already seated, and it was not what he expected. Commander Dawson was there in a clean uniform, looking serious for once. Beside him sat Patricia Voss, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled back tight. She was a career diplomat, the kind of person who smiled warmly while calculating every word. Next to her was a young translator named Danny Chu, who kept frowning at a tablet and muttering about the translation software getting verb tenses wrong. And at the far end of the table sat a man named Greg Faulkner, who wore a business suit and a grin that suggested he was very pleased with himself for being there. "Who is that one?" LawHFY whispered to Soth. "He says he represents private sector interests, Ambassador." "What does that mean?" "I believe it means he represents money." LawHFY decided to ignore him and focus on the task at hand. He stood at the head of the table and activated a holographic display. The air above the table filled with shimmering text, thousands of lines of it, scrolling slowly in the soft blue light of the projection. "These," LawHFY said with the gravity of someone unveiling a holy text, "are the Articles of Integration. They contain 11,482 laws, statutes, and behavioral mandates that form the foundation of the Galactic Concord. Every species that joins the Concord must accept them in full, without change, without exception. They have kept peace among the stars for 60,000 years." There was a silence. Dawson leaned forward and squinted at the hologram. Voss put on a pair of reading glasses. Danny Chu was already trying to download the text onto his tablet. Faulkner let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of rules," Faulkner said. "They are not rules," LawHFY corrected. "They are the law." "Can we get a copy to review?" Voss asked. "Of course. The standard review period is one of your lunar cycles. Approximately 1 month. 1 month to review 11,000 laws? Most species require only a few days. The laws are logical and clearly written." Voss gave a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "We'll take the full month." The articles were transmitted to Earth that night. Within 6 hours, they had been leaked to the public. No one was ever sure who did it. The leading theory was that it was either a low-level aide with a grudge, or Greg Faulkner, who had been seen grinning at his phone shortly before the leak. It did not matter who leaked them. What mattered was what happened next. Every law school on Earth started reading them. Every think tank published analyses. Every news channel ran segments with panels of experts, arguing about what the articles meant. Universities held emergency seminars. Online forums exploded with debates. Someone created a website that let people vote on which articles were the most offensive. And it crashed 3 times in the first day from the traffic. The problems became clear very quickly. One article said that no species could keep a military larger than a certain size. Humanity's combined fleet was 12 times over the limit. Another article said that all communications between species had to go through Concord-approved channels, which would effectively shut down the open internet. Another required all territorial disputes to be settled by a tribunal whose decisions could not be appealed. Another banned artificial intelligence above a certain level of complexity. Humanity had passed that level 15 years ago. Another said that all scientific discoveries had to be shared with the Concord within 1 year. No patents, no ownership, no keeping secrets. Megan Holt, who had been assigned to work with the diplomatic team, read through the articles 3 times. Then she sat down and wrote a report to her commanding officer that said in plain language what everyone was already thinking. They want us to give up our military, our internet, our technology, our independence, and our right to live where we already live. And they want us to say thank you while we do it. Back on Haven Point, the review meetings continued. Every day brought a new set of questions from the human side, and every answer made things worse. Article 7 would require us to decommission 90% of our fleet, Dawson said at one meeting, reading from a tablet. Correct, Vrethnolai said. A species of your development level does not require such a large military force. We might disagree with that. Article 19, Voss said, moving on. All interspecies communication must be routed through Concord channels. Does that include internal communication? Communication between humans? If it involves content that could be received by or relevant to another species, yes. That's everything. That's all communication. The system is very efficient. You will find it preferable to your current methods. Danny Chu looked up from his tablet. Article 56 says we have to share all scientific discoveries. Does that include medical research, military technology, things we haven't published yet? All discoveries. The Concord believes that knowledge belongs to all species equally. There was a long pause. Faulkner, who had been leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, let out a short laugh. Everyone looked at him. Sorry, he said, not looking sorry at all. It's just that you're asking a species that invented patent law to give away everything it knows for free. You might as well ask a cat to take a bath. Vrethnolai did not understand the reference, but he understood the tone. He looked around the table at the human faces, and for the first time in his long career, he saw something that made his wings tighten against his back. He did not see fear. He did not see obedience. He did not see the quiet acceptance that every other species had shown when they learned what membership in the Concord required. He saw stubbornness. It was a small thing, just a tightness around the jaw, a steadiness in the eyes, a way of sitting that said no without the word being spoken. He had never seen it during an integration before, and he did not know what to do with it. He reported back to the tribunal that evening. His message was brief and carefully worded, but the meaning was clear. The humans are reading the articles, he wrote. All of them. Every word. I do not believe they intend to accept. The tribunal's response was a single line. They always do. Vrethnolai read the response, set down his communicator, and looked out the window of his quarters at the blue planet turning slowly below. He had a feeling, deep in his thorax, that the tribunal was wrong. He could not prove it yet, but he could feel it, the way you feel a storm before it arrives. A change in the air, a drop in pressure, a silence that means something loud is coming. He did not sleep well that night. The deadline came on a Tuesday morning, 31 days after first contact. Vrethnolai sat in the meeting room aboard Haven Point and waited. He had prepared the formal acceptance documents. He had written a short speech. He had even brought a ceremonial sash, as was tradition when a new species officially joined the Concord. It was a pale gold fabric, woven with symbols representing unity, and he had folded it neatly on the table beside him. Patricia Voss walked in right on time. She was alone except for Danny Chu, who carried a small device in his hand and looked like he had not slept in several days. Voss sat down across from Vrethnolai and placed a single data chip on the table between them. Ambassador, she said, thank you for your patience over the past month. We've completed our review. Excellent, Vrethnolai said, reaching for the chip. I will transmit your acceptance to the tribunal immediately. That isn't an acceptance. Vrethnolai stopped. His hand hung in the air above the chip. His compound eyes shifted from their usual calm blue to a pale yellow, which among Delvani was a sign of confusion. "It's a counter-proposal," Voss said. 2,200 pages. We've gone through every article that conflicts with our existing laws, our values, and our strategic needs, and we've proposed an alternative for each one. Vrethnolai did not pick up the chip. He pulled his hand back slowly and folded all four arms across his chest. "Ms. Voss, in 60,000 years of the Galactic Concord, no species has ever submitted a counter-proposal. We're aware of that. The articles are not a negotiation. They are the foundation upon which galactic civilization rests. They cannot be changed. We're not asking you to change them for everyone. We're asking for modified terms that reflect our unique circumstances. There are no unique circumstances. Every species is treated equally under the law." Voss leaned forward slightly. Her voice was still calm, still polite, but there was something underneath it now, something firm that had not been there before. "Ambassador, with respect, treating every species exactly the same, regardless of their differences, is not equality. It's just convenience." Vrethnolai's wings made a small rustling sound. He stared at her for a long moment, then looked at the data chip on the table as if it were something dangerous. In a way, it was. In his entire career, no one had ever done this. He had no protocol for it, no precedent, no script. Commander Dawson appeared in the doorway. He had been waiting outside, and now he leaned against the frame with his arms crossed. He looked tired but steady, the way a man looks when he has made a hard decision and is done second-guessing it. "We're not trying to insult you, Ambassador," Dawson said. "We read every single one of your laws, all 11,000 of them. We understand what you're trying to do, and we respect it. Peace is worth protecting, but some of those laws would require us to stop being who we are, and we can't do that. We won't do that." Vrethnolai looked from Dawson to Voss and back again. "You understand that the Concord does not accept modifications. If you do not sign the articles as written, you will be classified as non-compliant." "We understand," Voss said. "Non-compliance carries consequences, economic sanctions, territorial quarantine, in extreme cases, military enforcement. We understand that too. And you still refuse?" Voss did not blink. "We are not refusing to join the Concord. We are refusing to join on terms that require us to surrender our sovereignty. There is a difference." The data chip sat on the table between them, small and quiet, and full of words that were about to change the galaxy. Vrethnolai transmitted the counter-proposal to the High Tribunal that afternoon. He included a personal note, recommending that the tribunal at least read it before making a decision. He explained that the humans had put genuine thought into their alternatives, that the proposals were detailed and reasonable, and that he believed there was room for a productive conversation. The tribunal's response came in 6 hours. It was the fastest they had ever acted on anything in recorded history. Rejected, unanimously. The message was accompanied by a formal declaration that Earth was now classified as a non-compliant contacted species. Economic sanctions would take effect immediately. A territorial quarantine would be established within 30 days. And if humanity did not accept the articles within 60 days, the tribunal would authorize military enforcement. Dawson was in the station's small galley when the news came through. He was drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed from dust and regret, which was the only kind of coffee Haven Point had. Holt found him there and handed him a tablet with the tribunal's response. He read it twice. Then he set down his coffee and was quiet for a long time. "Get me a secure channel to Fleet Command," he said, "and get Admiral Dunn on the line. She needs to know what's coming." "Are we really going to do this?" Holt asked. She was not afraid. She was just making sure. "We're not the ones doing it," Dawson said. "They gave us two choices. Give up everything or fight. That's not really a choice." Back in the meeting room, Voss was still seated across from Vrethnoli. The ceremonial sash sat untouched on the table, its gold fabric catching the light. "I'm sorry it came to this," Voss said, and she meant it. Vrethnoli studied her face. He was old enough and experienced enough to tell when someone was being sincere, and she was. That made it worse somehow. It would have been easier if the humans had been arrogant or hostile, if they had shouted or threatened or made demands. He knew how to handle that. But this quiet, steady, almost sad refusal was something he had no tools for. "Ms. Voss," he said carefully, "I have watched 37 species join the Concord. Every single one of them was afraid when they first learned the articles. Fear is normal. But they all accepted in the end because they understood that being part of something larger than themselves was worth the sacrifice. We're not afraid, Ambassador." "No," Vrethnoli said quietly. "And that is what concerns me." He paused, choosing his next words with great care. "The Concord will send a fleet. It is not a bluff. They have done it before, though not in a very long time. The last species that refused compliance was the Vathari, almost 9,000 years ago. They resisted for 3 days before surrendering." "What happened to them?" "They accepted the articles and were integrated. They are productive members of the Concord today." "And if they hadn't surrendered?" Vrethnoli did not answer, which was an answer in itself. Voss stood up. She smoothed her jacket and picked up the data chip from the table. "Ambassador, I want you to know that this was not a decision we made lightly. Every government on Earth debated this. Every parliament, every Congress, every council. The people were asked, and they gave their answer." "What was their answer?" Voss looked at him with those sharp, steady eyes. "They said that freedom is not something you negotiate away. Not for safety, not for membership, not for anything." She turned and walked out of the room. Dawson followed her. Danny Chu lingered for a moment, gave Vrethnoli an apologetic shrug, and then left too. Vrethnoli sat alone in the room for a long time. The holographic display was still active, the text of the articles still glowing softly above the table. 11,000 laws that had governed the galaxy since before humans had learned to make fire. They had never been challenged. They had never needed to be. He reached out and picked up the ceremonial sash. He folded it carefully and placed it back in its case. He would not be needing it. Outside the window, he could see the human ships beginning to move, pulling back from Haven Point, reforming into groups, heading toward positions that looked very much like defensive lines. They had probably been preparing for weeks, even while the diplomats talked and the translators argued and the coffee brewed. They had hoped for peace, but planned for war. Vrethnoli recognized the strategy, because it was a good one. It was, he thought, a very human one. He closed the case and went to write his report. It was not a report anyone would want to read. The Concord Enforcement Fleet arrived 6 weeks after the Tribunal's ultimatum. It came out of hyperspace in a single coordinated wave. 340 warships from 9 different member species, arranged in the standard Concord battle formation that had been used for thousands of years. At its center was the Delvani battlecruiser Axiom of Order, a massive ship bristling with weapons that had never been fired in anger, because no species had ever been foolish enough to force the issue. Fleet Commander LawHFY stood on the bridge of the Axiom and studied the tactical display. He was Delvani like Vrethnoli, but where the ambassador was thin and diplomatic, LawHFY was broad and blunt. He had overseen 7 enforcement actions in his career, and none of them had lasted more than a few hours. Most species surrendered the moment they saw the fleet. The ones that did not surrendered after the first warning shot. He expected this to be no different. "Scan the human positions," he ordered. The display lit up with the human defense line. It stretched between Mars and the asteroid belt in a layered formation that the Concorde tactical officers had to study for several minutes before they understood it. There were 94 human warships, spread in loose clusters rather than tight formations. Behind them were over 200 civilian vessels, everything from cargo haulers to mining rigs to research ships, all armed with whatever weapons they could find or build. And scattered throughout the asteroid belt were dozens of orbital platforms that had been disguised as communication satellites until very recently. 300 armed vessels, LawHFY said. Mostly civilian. This will not take long. LawHFY, who had been allowed aboard the Axiom as a diplomatic observer, looked at the display and felt his thorax tighten. Commander, I would advise caution. The humans are not like other species. You have said this before, Ambassador. I have noted your concern. They have had 6 weeks to prepare. They knew we were coming. Every species knows we are coming. It does not help them. On the other side of the battle line, Admiral Carla Dunn stood on the bridge of the carrier USS Valor and watched the Concorde fleet on her own tactical display. She was a small woman with short gray hair and a face that did not show much emotion, which was useful because the emotion she was feeling right now was something close to terror. Not for herself, but for the thousands of people under her command who were about to fight a fleet 3 times their size. They're broadcasting a compliance order, said Lieutenant Kyle Perry from his station. He was young, barely 30, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were not. It was the standard Concorde ultimatum, the same words that had been sent to dozens of species over 60,000 years. Accept the articles within 1 standard hour or face military action. She noted that it was not addressed to any specific person or government. It was addressed to the species known as humanity. As if they were all one thing, one mind, one decision. Send our response, Dunn said. The response had been written by Patricia Voss and approved by every government on Earth. It was 1 sentence long. Humanity respectfully declines and will defend its sovereignty. Perry sent it. The bridge was quiet for a moment. 1 hour, Perry said. I know, Dunn said. She opened a fleet-wide channel. All ships, this is done. You know what's coming. You know the plan. Stay loose, stay fast, and look out for each other. We didn't ask for this fight, but we're going to finish it. Done out. The Concorde fleet began its advance. What happened next was the single most surprising military engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. The Concorde fleet moved forward in its standard formation, a dense wall of ships designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers and coordinated firepower. It was the same tactic they had used for millennia. It worked because every species in the galaxy fought the same way, in neat formations, following predictable patterns, doing what the tactical manuals said to do. Humans did not fight that way. The moment the Concorde fleet crossed the engagement line, the human formation broke apart. It did not retreat, and it did not hold its ground. It shattered into dozens of small groups that scattered in every direction and then came screaming back in from angles the Concorde fleet had not covered. The first wave of human ships hit the flanks of the Concorde formation, while the second wave punched through gaps in the center. They were fast and they were precise, and they targeted engines and weapon systems instead of going for kills. LawHFY watched his tactical display, and for the first time in his career, did not immediately know what to do. The humans were not following any battle doctrine he recognized. They moved like a swarm of insects, independent, but somehow coordinated, each ship making its own decisions while still working toward the same goal. When he shifted his formation to counter one group, 3 others exploited the opening. They are not holding formation, his tactical officer said, stating the obvious with a tone of bewilderment. I can see that. Target their largest ships. They do not have largest ships, Commander. They are all small and moving independently. Then the civilian vessels entered the fight, and things got worse. The mining rigs, which the Concorde fleet had dismissed as irrelevant, turned their industrial cutting lasers on Concorde warships, and sliced through armor plating like it was paper. The research vessels deployed experimental weapons that had never been tested in combat, some of which worked spectacularly, and some of which did not work at all, and one of which appeared to turn a small section of space temporarily inside out. A civilian freighter, its hull painted with the logo of a shipping company, accelerated to full speed on a collision course with a Concorde destroyer. Its crew ejected in escape pods 3 seconds before impact. The freighter hit the destroyer amidships, and both ships ceased to exist. The Concorde fleet tried to jam human communications. It worked for about 4 minutes. The humans switched to backup systems. The Concorde jammed those too. The humans switched to light-based signaling, blinking messages between ships using old codes. When that became impractical, they stopped communicating entirely and fell back on prearranged plans, each ship knowing exactly what to do without being told. LawHFY had studied military history. He had read about every enforcement action the Concorde had ever conducted. He had trained for scenarios involving resistant species, stubborn species, even clever species. He had never trained for a species that improvised in the middle of a battle, that used mining equipment as weapons, that rammed ships into each other on purpose, that kept fighting after their communications were destroyed, because they had already planned for that possibility. The battle lasted 9 hours. It was the longest military engagement in Concorde history. When the firing finally stopped, the numbers told a story that no one on either side wanted to read. The Concorde had lost 38 ships destroyed, and 74 more, too damaged to continue fighting. Humanity had lost 41 warships and 63 civilian vessels. The orbital platforms in the asteroid belt were gone. Debris from both sides drifted through space, in a field that stretched for thousands of kilometers. It was not a victory for anyone. It was exactly what the title on every future history book would call it: a catastrophe. Admiral Dunn sat on the bridge of the Valor. The ship was damaged. Half the displays were dead. There was a crack in the forward viewport that the engineering team had sealed with emergency foam. She had a bruise across the left side of her face from where she had been thrown against a console during a near miss, and she was fairly sure her collarbone was broken. She did not care about any of that. She opened a channel to the axiom of order. She did not know if the Concorde had a concept for what she was about to propose. She only knew that the next hour would decide whether this catastrophe became something worse. LawHFY answered. His compound eyes were a deep, dark red, a color that LawHFY, standing behind him, recognized as shock. Dunn looked into the camera and said, "We can keep doing this, but I don't think either of us wants to. So let's stop." There was a silence that lasted a very long time. Then LawHFY, who had never in his life failed to complete a mission, said 2 words: "We hold." The guns went quiet, and in the silence that followed, something in the galaxy shifted. Something that had held firm for 60,000 years cracked, just a little, and through that crack, something new began to grow. The ceasefire held through the night, and into the next day, and then the day after that. Both fleets stayed where they were, battered and bleeding, licking their wounds in the cold dark between Mars and the asteroid belt. No one moved, no one fired. The only ships that crossed the invisible line between the two sides were medical vessels, and they went in both directions. That was the part that confused the Concorde the most. 3 hours after the ceasefire, 4 human medical ships crossed into Concorde space and began broadcasting a simple message on an open channel. "We are here to help. We are unarmed. Please do not fire." They moved slowly, with their weapons bays visibly empty, and their hulls lit up so there could be no mistaking what they were. They docked with damaged Concorde vessels and their crews went aboard with medical kits and engineering tools and got to work. Poole, who was monitoring communications aboard the Serenity of Law, watched the sensor feeds with his gelatinous body trembling. "Ambassador, the human medical teams are treating our wounded. They are stabilizing Delvani crew members. They have brought supplies compatible with Marathi biology. They came prepared to help us." Vrethnolai stood at the viewport and watched one of the human medical ships attach itself to a crippled Concorde frigate. Through the magnified display, he could see human doctors in white suits moving through the alien ship, carrying equipment, setting up field hospitals in damaged corridors, working alongside Concorde medics who did not know what to make of any of it. "They studied our biology," Vrethnolai said quietly, "during the negotiations. While we were talking about laws and articles and compliance, they were studying how to save our lives in case things went wrong." "That is either very kind or very unsettling," Poole said. "It is both." On the Valor, Admiral Dunn was sitting in the medical bay getting her collarbone treated when Dawson's face appeared on the small screen beside her bed. He looked exhausted. Everyone looked exhausted. "The ceasefire is holding," Dawson said. "Voss wants to restart negotiations. She thinks there's a window." "A window for what?" Dunn asked, wincing as the medic applied a bone-knitting device to her shoulder. "For something new. She says the old rules are broken. The Concorde can't pretend their system is perfect anymore, not after today. And we can't pretend we don't need allies, not after the losses we took. So what does she want? She wants to sit back down at that table and try again. But this time, she wants to build something different. Not their rules, not our rules, something in between." Dunn was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 41 warships she had lost, the 63 civilian vessels, the thousands of people who were gone, people who had families and homes and lives that were now over because two civilizations could not find a way to talk to each other. She thought about the Concorde ships she had destroyed, and the people inside them, people she had never met, who had probably not wanted this fight any more than she had. "Tell Voss she has my support," Dunn said. "And tell the Concorde I want to meet their wounded, captain to captain, person to person. You're in a medical bay with a broken collarbone. Then they'll see I bleed the same as they do." Negotiations resumed aboard Haven Point 3 days later. The station was crowded now. Voss was there, along with Danny Chu, who had somehow gotten even less sleep. Dawson was there. Dunn attended by holographic link from the Valor, her arm in a sling, and her expression making it clear that she would tolerate no nonsense. And on the Concorde side, Vrethnolai returned to the table. He had fought the tribunal for the right to continue as lead negotiator. Several members had wanted to replace him with someone harder, someone who would push for full compliance or nothing. Vrethnolai had argued that full compliance was no longer an option, and that pretending otherwise would lead to more death. The tribunal, still shaken by the battle reports, had reluctantly agreed. Vrethnolai sat down across from Voss and said plainly and without ceremony, "The tribunal is furious. There are voices calling for a second fleet, a larger one that would not fail." Voss met his eyes. "And what are you calling for, Ambassador?" He was quiet for a moment. His wings were still, his hands folded on the table. When he spoke, his voice was different than it had been before. The certainty was gone. In its place was something more honest. "I have served the Concorde for a very long time, Miss Voss. I believed the articles were perfect. I believed they were the only path to peace. But I have never seen a species do what yours did. Not the fighting. Many species have fought us. I have never seen a species fight us, and then send its doctors to save our wounded. I have never seen a species refuse to bend, and then immediately sit back down and offer to talk." He unfolded his hands. "I am calling for a new approach." What followed was the most intensive diplomatic effort in the history of the galaxy. Voss and Vrethnoli worked together for weeks, barely sleeping, building something that had never existed before. Danny Chu translated day and night until his voice gave out, and he had to communicate through written notes. Dawson handled the military coordination, making sure both fleets stayed calm and fed, and that no one on either side did anything stupid. Holt managed the communications, fielding calls from Earth governments, Concord delegations, and an increasingly impatient press corps that wanted answers. The document they produced was called the Haven Accords. It was not the Articles of Integration. It was something entirely new. Humanity would keep its military, but would sign mutual defense treaties with neighboring species. Instead of tribunal arbitration, a new joint council would handle disputes, with equal seats for humans and Concord members. Humanity would not give away its technology, but would create shared research programs. The ban on artificial intelligence would not apply, but humans would agree to transparency standards developed together with Concord scientists. Trade would be open, borders would be respected, sovereignty would be maintained. Not everyone was happy. Several Concord species protested that the humans were getting special treatment. The HFY aggregate, whose research station near Tau Ceti had started the territorial argument in the first place, filed a formal objection. 3 tribunal members resigned in disgust. On the human side, there were protests too. Some people thought they had given up too much. Others thought they had not given up enough. Opinion columns were written, speeches were made. It was messy and loud and very, very human. But the accords held. They held because the people who wrote them had seen what happened when they did not exist, and none of them wanted to see it again. On the day the Haven Accords were formally signed, Vrethnoli stood on the observation deck of Haven Point, beside Patricia Voss. Earth hung in the distance, blue and white and small against the endless dark. It looked fragile from up here. It looked like something worth protecting. Your species is going to be a problem, Vrethnoli said. We usually are, Voss replied. The Concord has existed for 60,000 years because every species followed the same rules. You have broken that system in 2 months. We didn't break it. We showed you it needed updating. Vrethnoli made a sound that might have been a laugh, though among Delvani it was hard to tell. Perhaps, but the tribunal will be watching you very closely. Let them watch, said Dawson, who had appeared behind them carrying 2 cups of coffee. He held one out to the ambassador. Here. You look like you could use this. Vrethnoli looked at the coffee. He had tried it once before, during the first week of negotiations. It had been one of the most unpleasant things he had ever put in his mouth, and he had once been required to eat ceremonial fungus paste during a diplomatic dinner with the Gorathi. He took the cup anyway. I still do not understand how your species drinks this voluntarily, he said. It's not about the taste, Dawson said. It's about the ritual. Vrethnoli took a sip. It was exactly as terrible as he remembered. He drank it anyway, because he was learning that with humans, the gesture mattered more than the preference. The willingness to sit together, to share something small, to say without words that even though we are different, even though we just fought a war, even though the future is uncertain and frightening and full of things neither of us can predict, we are here, together, trying. He looked at Earth, hanging in the dark like a blue jewel, and he thought about all the species he had brought into the Concord over his long career. The obedient ones, the ones who had read the rules and signed on the dotted line and never caused a moment of trouble. None of them had ever been interesting. He took another sip of the terrible coffee and watched the planet turn. No, he said softly, I don't suppose you're going anywhere. Below them, Earth kept spinning, the way it always had, messy and loud and stubborn and alive. And somewhere out in the dark, the galaxy was learning to make room. The Galactic Concord had been watching Earth for almost 200 years. They had picked up the first radio signals back when humans were still figuring out how to split atoms, and they had decided to wait. Every species needed time to grow. Every species needed time to become ready. The Concord was patient. They had been doing this for 60,000 years, and they knew how it worked. A species would develop, reach a certain level of technology, and then the Concord would show up, hand them a rulebook, and welcome them into the family. It had worked thousands of times before. It had never failed. Ambassador LawHFY was chosen to lead the contact mission. He was Delvani, a tall insectoid species with 4 arms, compound eyes that shifted color depending on mood, and a pair of translucent wings folded neatly behind his back. He had done this 37 times before. 37 species brought into the Concord without a single problem. He was experienced. He was considered the very best at what he did. His ship, the Serenity of Law, was a diplomatic cruiser the size of a small city. It dropped out of hyperspace just past the rings of Saturn, elegant and silent, its hull glowing faintly with the energy of its shields. The plan was simple. Announce their presence, wait for the humans to send a representative, begin the process. The plan fell apart in about 4 minutes. Ambassador, said Poole, his communications officer. Poole was Marathi, a species that resembled a large blob of blue gelatin. He wobbled nervously at his station. We are being hailed. Excellent, LawHFY said. By whom? By everyone. 14 human vessels had appeared on their sensors. They came from every direction, moving at different speeds, on different headings, broadcasting on different frequencies. 3 were military frigates with weapons hot. 2 were science vessels covered in sensor dishes and antenna arrays. 1 was a sleek government transport with diplomatic markings, and the rest were a collection of civilian ships that had no business being there at all, including a battered mining rig that appeared to have a homemade railgun bolted to its cargo bay. They are all claiming authority, Poole said, his gelatinous body rippling with confusion. The military ships say they have jurisdiction. The government transport says it has jurisdiction. One of the civilian ships says it represents something called the free press and is demanding an interview. LawHFY stared at the sensor display. In 37 first contacts, he had never seen anything like this. Every other species had sent 1 ship, 1 representative, 1 voice. Humans had sent a circus. The lead military vessel was the USS Carthage, a fast attack frigate that looked like it had been built for war and then given a fresh coat of paint in a hurry. Its commander was Nate Dawson, a man in his early 40s with a calm voice and tired eyes. He sat in his captain's chair with the easy posture of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by chaos. His communications officer, Lieutenant Megan Holt, stood beside him with a headset on, arguing with what sounded like 4 people at once. The UN wants us to wait, Holt said, covering the microphone. Geneva says the Secretary General has a prepared statement. What time is it in Geneva? Dawson asked. 3 in the morning. Is he awake? No. Then I'm not waiting. Dawson straightened in his chair. Open a channel to the alien ship. Sir, I also have the European Space Agency on line 2, the Chinese delegation on line 3, and someone from CNN on line 4 asking if we can get them a closer shot. Ignore all of this. Human had just shrugged and said sorry, like he was greeting a neighbor who had caught him mowing his lawn in his underwear. Respond, LawHFY told Paul. Tell them we are the delegation of the Galactic Concord, and we come in peace to discuss the integration of their species into the galactic community. The message was sent. The response came back almost instantly, not from Dawson, but from the government transport, the science vessels, 2 of the civilian ships, and the mining rig, all at the same time, all saying different things. Dawson came back on the channel a moment later. Sorry about that. Everyone's a little excited. How about you just talk to me for now, and we'll sort out the politics later? Is he authorized to speak for his species? Vrethnolai asked Pul quietly. It is unclear, Ambassador. He seems to be authorized to speak for his ship. Authority, beyond that, appears to be a matter of active debate among the humans. Vrethnolai watched the cluster of human ships on his display. They were still jockeying for position, nudging closer, trying to get a better look. One of the civilian ships had activated what appeared to be a camera drone. The mining rig was slowly rotating so that its homemade railgun was no longer pointed directly at the Serenity of Law, which Vrethnolai supposed was meant to be a gesture of good faith. He had spent his entire career dealing with species that were orderly, hierarchical, and obedient. Species that understood authority and respected structure. Species that did what they were told. These humans were none of those things. They were loud and messy and disorganized, and they could not even agree on who should say hello first. They had sent 14 ships when one would have been proper. They had broadcast on 9 frequencies when one would have been sufficient. Their commander had opened diplomatic relations with a joke and an apology. Vrethnolai turned to his aide, a young Delvani named Soth, and said very quietly, "Make a note in the mission log." "Yes, Ambassador." "This species is going to be a problem." He did not yet know how right he was.